Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, debt slavers, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks, potheads. I'm a Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go back to the U.S. Or actually, let's go global, because this U.S. war on drugs is a global effort, and it goes along with all the other wars we have: war on poverty, war on fraud. Oh no, there's no war on fraud. War on poverty, and the war on terror, and the war on drugs, and these giant money holes that the government comes up with. And anyway, a very interesting story came out talking about the Nixon administration, and specifically a conversation between Nixon and John Ehrlichman that purportedly took place. And as this article I attached below points out, there's really no way to verify whether this conversation actually took place, as John Ehrlichman is dead and Nixon is dead. But when you look at the details, it just sounds right. It just sounds like what the way our leaders think, the way our government thinks, and this is another good example of that. So whether there's any veracity to this tale or not, I don't know, but it's kind of a moot point because, like I say, it makes sense. And it makes sense because let's look at the story. Supposedly there was a conversation between Nixon and Ehrlichman and this interviewer, and he talked about the White House using the war on drugs basically to go after the anti-war movement and radicals, young radicals, specifically the anti-war left and blacks. And Ehrlichman points out that the White House had two enemies at the time, although as we know now, looking back, the White House had a lot more enemies than just two. And while Nixon was in office, so Ehrlichman basically puts forth the idea that they couldn't really make it illegal to be a hippie or a Negro. So they associated the left with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalized them heavily to disrupt the communities. And that makes a lot of sense. It's not like the government was that interested in drugs or whether people were taking drugs. And certainly the 50 years that has passed since then has proven that this fear was unfounded. But the Ehrlichman goes on. This is where I think it gets even more interesting, as he talks about once the war on drugs was set up, they could arrest leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the news. And then they asked him whether he knew that basically they were lying about the war on drugs, and he said, "Yeah, of course they did." And so that sounds more like the government we know. But I find it interesting that you see the war on drugs being used the same way that we see the war on terror going on now. They can use this war on terror to arrest leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night after night on the news in order to achieve some sort of a political goal. And right now we're seeing that in the political process as well. If you vilify someone night after night after night on the news, then it works. And that's what's being done with certain presidential candidates right now. Trump and Sanders being notable examples, and certainly Ron Paul before that, and anybody else that challenges the status quo. But anyway, it just shows that the government agenda, stated agenda, and what its real agenda is often completely different. So this is a good example of that, and we should take it to heart, examining other things the government does. And it's also interesting to note, in light of this article too, that we have the Nixon administration as well as the Reagan administration and Clinton administrations that have also had this deep involvement in Latin America that's often justified by this war on drugs. So we have paramilitaries and death squads and American equipment and soldiers littered all over Latin America to this day based on this war on drugs. And some other articles came out recently about the drug war, and I was going to do separate videos, but I think I'll just roll them into this one. One of them is cost of the drug war since Nixon was in office. Let's remember, this war has gone on for more than 50 years now. The U.S. has spent over $1 trillion since the Nixon administration on this war on drugs, and we have really gotten little for it except for more police state, more surveillance, and more lack of freedoms, not to mention another element that exacerbates race wars, class wars, etc. And I think it's important to point out, as I'll attach an article below, all these people that think Hillary Clinton is so great want to vote for her, she's had a lot to do with maintaining and escalating this war on drugs. This particular article points out the Merida initiative, and Hillary Clinton was a huge supporter and expanded it a lot, and it has to do with the drug war in Mexico, and it's essentially turned Mexico into one of the largest buyers of U.S. military equipment in the world, not to mention facilitating U.S. operations in Mexico. And in fact, this Merida initiative cost the U.S. $1.2 billion in 2012 alone. The amount of money, I shouldn't say cost the U.S., profits as far as transferring weapons and equipment to Mexico. So very lucrative, and no surprise that Hillary Clinton or any other government official certainly would be in on all this. And then the other article that goes along with this too is the results of recent legalizations in the United States, including here in Washington State as well as Colorado. And just this legalization in a handful of states has already made the Mexican border drug crossings drop by 75%. And so that's pretty amazing. I mean, if we have more and more states, particularly in the Southwest and California regions, get in on this legalization, then we should see that drop even more significantly. And apparently it's really hurting the drug cartels. Mexican farmers are complaining that prices have dropped by half, and it's becoming not economically feasible for them to grow or for the cartels to keep these operations going and make it worth their while to even bring the drugs up here. And of course, if the drug cartels start running out of money, they also can't buy arms, and so violence and arms shipments and all this stuff will drop commensurately with more legalization. And let's remember also that the amount of pot or the drug war itself has contributed as a huge cash cow for the police. So there's a political reason for the police certainly wanting to maintain this drug war, and also the U.S., because the U.S. government and the CIA and the FBI and all these law enforcement agencies can also use it as a cash cow, and it's also a great cover for operating in foreign countries all over the world, and supposedly in the name of this drug war. And so anyway, a very interesting article. So it turns out the drug war was actually a war on hippies and black people, and really had little to do with drugs, and really not a surprise there. All the more reason that this drug war needs to end, as they used to say back in the old days. Stop the madness. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.